Hey there, Mr. Terry, high school history teacher, back once again with another History Teacher X video. All right, you guys have been loving the post-election coverage, and I got another one across my feed and recommended to me that I thought would be really interesting to cover. It is, Trump has won the US election. Here's our foreign policy forecast. So this is from the channel Warfronts, which is one of Simon Whistler's many channels. And as a non-American, I think it'd be interesting to check out what he thinks is kind of the future for foreign policy now. All right, this original video is going to be linked down below. Make sure you're supporting that. And of course, share your comments down below. Let's get started. All right, I hope to add some historical context to sort of this future forecast, adding history to the future, I guess you could say. All right, what do we got?
Election season is over in the United States of America, and Donald J. Trump has been declared victorious. On Monday, January the 20th, 2025, President-elect Trump will be formally inaugurated to the office of president, ushering in his second non-consecutive span of 4 years as America's commander-in-chief. When it comes to purely political...
Only president in the U.S. to do that was Grover Cleveland, meaning get elected, not serve that second term consecutively, but then be re-elected later.
Analysis, we trust that an abundance of American and international sources have the situation handled. Instead, on today's special episode of Warfronts, we're going to focus on one critical question. How will President Donald Trump transform the conflicts that are raging all around the world? We'll cover Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the battles between Israel and several factions in the Middle East, and a wide variety of other global wars and flashpoints. We'll weigh Donald...
So the major thing in the campaign that Trump was campaigning on was that between 2016, 2020, when he was the president, that the United States did not engage in any new wars. So that, I think, came off as more of like an isolationism in a way. But at the same time, we also know he has declared support for, say, like Israel, and that's an ongoing conflict. So that would be one I think that would be interesting to see. As of when I just filmed this, he said he's appointing Mike Huckabee, who's very pro-Israel, to be the ambassador of the United States to Israel. And we'll see what that does with conflicts. You know, there's like the quotes going around how Mike Huckabee, he views things like the West Bank differently than a lot of people, as it is, you know, like a Judea or Sumeria, not really like Palestinian land. So it'd be interesting to see how that conflict kind of changes. And also, by the way, interesting to see in this last month and a half or so what the Biden administration will do with the current conflicts, not just with Israel, but also Ukraine and Russia. Basically what Trump had said about the Ukraine-Russia thing was largely just, he said that war would not have happened if he was in office. So take that, you know, for I guess what you will, what he says about that foreign policy, but we'll see how his relationship with President Zelensky is going to go and how that conflict is going to go, and just other conflicts in general.
Donald Trump's past performance as president, a variety of other global wars and flashpoints. We'll weigh Donald Trump's past performance as president, his stated plans and policy approach, his likely choices in critical personnel, and his potential points of international influence to answer the ultimate question: in a world increasingly at war, what happens next?
So, all right, as I'm recording this, Trump has begun to select people in his cabinet and other positions. He's got a Secretary of Defense. He's got Secretary of State, which is going to be Marco Rubio. Like I said just before, Mike Huckabee is going to be an ambassador to Israel. So that's going to be important for foreign policy. And other positions will be coming out within the time I record this and post it, and in the next coming weeks, and that will definitely have an influence over foreign policy. So right now, mostly though, what we can look at is what Trump has kind of said in this campaign, and then also what his first presidency was like. But so much of what could happen to foreign policy, we could know better even before he takes office in January, depending on the positions in government that we know will have some kind of influence over foreign relations.
All right, before we begin today's episode, a brief note on sourcing. We at Warfronts recognize the complex nature of President-elect Trump's role in US politics. And while we will work to accurately represent the interests of both sides of that divide, we will not take either at face value. Allegations against Trump by themselves do not condemn him. Denials and defense by Trump or his staff by themselves do not exonerate him. Both unverified.
Good to hear that, and at least just kind of say what the approach is going to be. You know, to say something and then maybe do something is always maybe a little bit different. And we'll see if Simon and whoever helps him kind of research and form these ideas, if they kind of hold true to that throughout this analysis.
allegations and unsupported denials will be described as such.
Okay.
On Trump's policy positions, we will weigh his campaign pledges and his past actions over any attempts to deny or obfuscate them after the fact. On international matters, we will prioritize reporting by organizations that feature well-funded, well-positioned, and broadly respected foreign affairs bureaus over those that do not. With that in mind, let's begin. In foreign affairs, just like in all parts of life, intention doesn't always correlate directly with results. A world leader can say one thing and mean another. They can say one thing and do another. Or they can say and do exactly what they promised, only to be faced with a completely different set of results from what they expected.
Dare I say, one of the criticisms that people have of democracy is saying one thing to get elected, but then really the only thing you might have to have accountability if you do things or not is if you can get reelected. We know with President Trump, he can't serve another term, so can't necessarily be held to some of these campaign promises because he doesn't have to worry about reelection.
With that in mind, we're going to analyze the foreign policy positions of President-elect Trump as if they're only one part of the overall picture.
Okay.
But his positions are where we'll begin, and specifically with tariffs.
China?
For those unfamiliar with the term, a tariff is a form of tax that a government imposes on the import or export of goods, thus imposing that cost on the physical act of importing or exporting something rather than taxing businesses or consumers directly. If, for example, Germany places a 10% tariff on imports of champagne from France, then every time a bottle of champagne enters Germany, the German government collects an amount of money equivalent to 10% of that bottle's sale price.
Right.
In the 2024 election cycle, Trump made a new tariff policy into a central campaign promise, and the figures Trump has proposed are substantial to say the least. Prior to the election, Trump announced that his new administration would impose across-the-board tariffs on all imports entering the United States, regardless of their point of origin or the goods being imported, at a rate of somewhere between 10 and 20%.
Now, that has been, interestingly, one of the things that even the Republican Party has been very mixed on is those tariff ideas. And there is some historical context to that. For example, one of the most famous ones was during the Great Depression, the idea to kind of get manufacturing back into the United States and also potentially grow the job market was to put tariffs on. Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. And what this ended up doing actually had quite a negative effect. And what it did was essentially did like a trade war. So what ended up happening was the United States would put in these tariffs, right? Tax on imports. And then it was basically countered by other countries that then did the same thing. And what that did is decreased trade. So exporting, we know, is great for economics. But we're also a country that, to balance that out, that doesn't necessarily rely as much on, say, like imports that maybe some countries do, because we do have great resources. There's still a lot we import when it comes to food and other things, a lot of other things. But it'll be interesting to see if it does what he thinks. He thinks it's going to increase manufacturing without and help the economy that way without creating inflation. That's been one of the big things that people that have kind of attacked the tariff policy will talk about is we have this inflation problem right now, but that goods will go up in price because they'll cost more when we import, or anything that we import or relies on import exports for their pricing. So there is some context for that, and it'll be interesting to see how he believes, especially if he has kind of studied the history of tariffs in our country, if he thinks this will be different, or if it'll be organized maybe in a different way that won't have the negative effects, but will just bring the positive effects that he thinks it will bring.
On goods imported from China, Trump has vowed an additional 60% tariff across the board, in addition to the base tariff on international imports. Additionally, more targeted tariffs on specific goods from China or other nations could rise even higher.
Well, we know right now there would be a transitionary process too, because so many goods we get come from Asia. Okay, there's a lot of outsourcing of manufacturing, of course, that goes to Asia, and goods come from again, a place like China. And that tariff, we'll see if what that does, if that then means that those goods are going to cost more. So I think this transitionary process, because it seems like the long-term goal, as he was stating, was to increase more manufacturing here, make our own stuff, and then buy our own stuff. But in a globalized kind of economy that has imports and exports, and it's so international, that intermediary process at best could be a difficult transition.
Now, just a moment ago, we explained that this episode would be focused on global conflicts, but we mentioned these tariffs for
tariffs are
precisely
important.
that reason. More than just a tool to drive income to
Tariffs
the US
are foreign
government,
policy.
Tariffs in Trump's policy approach are a way to serve several objectives at once. By discouraging foreign imports, Trump hopes to stimulate America's homegrown manufacturing center.
Right.
But that isn't all. By targeting or relieving tariffs against a specific nation, Trump can impose punishments or incentivize good behavior, while with both targeted and general tariff regimes, Trump can have a substantial impact on the economies of other nations.
One thing you would have to get for companies, especially even, American companies that outsource manufacturing, which so many do, is having an incentive. Up until now, there hasn't really been a good incentive for major corporations to manufacture here in the United States when they can get better prices, cheaper labor, and be able to negotiate more directly with those foreign states. To get them to want to do that, to have the incentive to do it, because it's still about, of course, making money and beating out your competition. So there have to be some kind of incentive for the American businesses to do that, and maybe not just punishments for outsourcing, but like an incentive. So does that mean like subsidies, government subsidies for those, which has been a big thing. We do it in agriculture in the United States, but yeah, subsidies for companies to do manufacturing here in the United States.
The president-elect himself has referred to tariffs as a way to promote peace and discourage war. Now, we'll hold off on a discussion about those tariffs' impact on the American economy, but we would be remiss not to
That's why the EU is
emphasize here
created,
that regardless of partisan positions within the United States, America's allies and its adversaries alike have expressed concerns about that sort of regime, and very few have offered even a limited endorsement of such a system.
Trade wars and that kind of economic competition was also an influence in the rise of what's eventually is going to lead to warfare in the early 20th century with like World War I, age of imperialism and industrial revolution, and really just like mercantilism led to being one of the issues that went into the First World War. And then after the Second World War, the creation of the EU was actually to bring down a lot of those economic barriers. So there would be fewer trade wars, and then would kind of keep the peace. So if he's arguing that tariffs will actually, from being like international wars or conflicts, I don't know what kind of historical precedent we have for that.
We should also emphasize, however, that despite the potential for procedural challenge in the United States, several existing US laws grant Trump the authority to levy tariffs, basically unilaterally. His proposed Trump Reciprocal Trade Act would make it even easier. Moving on from tariffs, there are Trump's explicitly defense-related positions to consider, starting with his views on the NATO alliance. During campaigning events, Trump has indicated that he intends
not a big fan of NATO.
Potentially
He's
work
not.
to alter, quote, NATO's purpose and NATO's mission. He's asked for reimbursement by Europe for nearly $200 billion worth of money sent to Ukraine and cut NATO funding during his previous tenure.
That
Trump
won't happen.
recounted early in the 2024 electoral cycle that in his past administration, Trump had personally told a European leader that the United States would not protect NATO members who had not met the alliance's non-mandatory defense spending expectations and would instead encourage that nation's adversaries to do, quote, whatever the hell they want.
So this has been an interesting one that people have kind of debated about, is the United States' role there. Now, if you do look at data when it comes to things like how much the United States supports, how much bigger our military is that can aid NATO, that the United States has an enormous percent of the financial and military sort of burden, I guess you would say, of the rest of NATO. And that's a big thing that basically he's saying that, hey, we shouldn't have this or should need to do this. Now, I don't know if that means that there's going to be a cut in military spending as a result of this, or just try to get these other countries to fork up. But if they don't, then what is going to be the impact? So they don't necessarily enlarge their forces that can commit to NATO action or the money, then what is going to happen? Is the United States going to then say pull out of NATO? And that could have all kinds of effects. Wonder what that would have on non-NATO countries, say like Russia being the big one that you would highlight there. What would it do to the U.S. in terms of spending? So like, let's say on the military, so let's say the United States pulled out of NATO. would you still keep a very high spending and military size? Like keep that standing very high because you don't have NATO allies? Or would they reduce the size because they're like, hey, we don't have to support these other countries. Maybe we can scale down our own military because we're only worrying about ourselves right now. But let's say they do. These other countries in NATO do fork up the bill and the military size. Will the United States then, and under Trump, be like, okay, well now here's also a reason why maybe we can lower our military numbers and military spending. There are so many different outcomes here that I don't know if they've been clearly articulated by Trump that could really go a lot of different ways, I think.
Trump has not released any detailed policy proposal to deal with the NATO alliance, although other campaign statements he's made well into the general election cycle indicate that Trump remains committed to the goal of supporting only NATO member nations that spend sufficiently on their own defense. On a related note, Trump's frequent praise of Hungarian leader Viktor Orban, considered something of a pariah across NATO, has further increased concerns that Trump may act in a way contrary to NATO's.
He's a big fan of Trump.
In the Indo-Pacific, Trump has shown broader concern towards supporting America's partners. Japan's leaders appear to be broadly unconcerned by the prospect of a second go-round. Meanwhile, during the 2024 presidential campaign,
there's another one. What's going to happen with Tokyo or
were dispatched
with Japan?
to speak with Japanese and South Korean officials and relay that, quoting from a Reuters article on the conversations, the ex-US president will support the two capitals' work to warm once frigid ties and advance military, economic, and diplomatic cooperation to ease global tensions. On Taiwan, his approach.
Well, one of the major tensions is the fact that after World War II, United States pretty much is not going to allow the Japanese to have a military. They have a small quasi-defensive force, but the United States has basically pledged to be the military presence for Japan, which has then increased some hostilities to some of the areas around, say like a Korea or China, that you have the United States as this military force clear over on the other side of the ocean that is seen as kind of a more aggressive act by those countries that don't necessarily like that. But we have that interesting kind of policy. That's another one. At what time do you readdress that relationship, military relationship the United States has with Japan? I mean, we're getting pretty far away from World War II now. So does the United States just pull out and say, hey, Japan, it's time for you? Maybe there's a transition. It's like, hey, Japan, it's time for you to do your military thing again. We don't think what will happen, that happened in World War II and leading up to World War II and the whole Japanese empire. Don't think hopefully that will happen again. But if that happens too, then what happens between like Japan and China? If they have military conflicts, it would be more likely to have one that the United States pulls out of. But again, is there going to be consistency in this policy where it's like stay out of these foreign affairs? So there's a lot of questions to ask.
Approach has been more mixed. On the one hand, he's advocated to ease global tensions. On Taiwan, his approach has been more mixed. On the one hand, he's advocated steep tariffs on Taiwanese semiconductors and called for Taiwan to directly compensate the US for defense. On the other, as we'll discuss further, many of his close advisors emphasize making Taiwan the centerpiece of an anti-China strategy.
See, that's the Taiwan situation. I don't know how much context is understood about that too, but like Taiwan's sort of like independence has largely been built upon the United States supporting it after the Chinese Civil War. It being basically where the regime that was overthrown by the Communist Party and Mao Zedong, where they went to and fled to and established their government. And so it's like, yeah, you're putting tariffs on a country that is, very much something that was propped up, almost, created in a lot of ways by the United States, and having that relationship that was largely built with that. So it will be interesting to see again what kind of consistency can follow in that. So Japan and Taiwan being kind of similar situations that way. One big difference is Taiwan, when it comes to like the military, can't do what the Japanese do. And there's been so many, threats and rhetoric about China trying to take Taiwan, because if you don't know, China claims Taiwan, does not see Taiwan as an independent state. And could they force themselves in if the United States, say, pulls out their support or, again, makes these tariffs so that the relationship breaks down? What could be the future of Taiwan for their own political autonomy?
On Israel in the Middle East, Trump has been emphasize making Taiwan the centerpiece of an anti-China strategy. On Israel in the Middle East, Trump has been clear that he would not stand in Jerusalem's way as it seeks victory in Gaza, and has not indicated opposition to Israel occupying or establishing direct rule over Gaza. Toward America's longtime adversaries.
And there was some antagonistic things that happened in that situation there. The movement, or at least support of the capital moving from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, was something very much opposed to by the Palestinian community of the region, and add fuel to the fire that we know has led to attacks like, say, last October. So there has been some, I think, precedent about what probably would be happening with that conflict and which side would kind of be there. But because you haven't seen necessarily the idea of like, hey, Israel needs to do more on their end, the United States wants to get out of that situation. You haven't seen that rhetoric as much, it seems like, that surrounds some of these other conflicts.
Trump has advocated a mix of confrontational and conciliatory actions. Toward Iran, Trump has indicated a return to the pressure-heavy policies that marked his
hostility to Iran would go up again.
Against Kamala Harris, Trump specifically highlighted frustration with the Biden administration's relatively lax enforcement of the sanctions Trump had imposed during his first term in office. Toward China, Trump's stance is almost entirely wrapped up in economic competition and the use of tariffs as pressure, but he's also indicated concern over China's increased militarization. On Russia, Trump has raised global eyebrows by essentially inviting Vladimir Putin to invade NATO members that don't hit the
Would a potential trade war help that hostility with
Ukraine?
China, though?
Made statements just weeks prior to Election Day blaming Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky rather than Vladimir Putin for the start of the war. Trump has frequently threatened and implied that he would halt or restrict US aid to Ukraine during his now upcoming second term. He has repeatedly emphasized a desire to bring the conflict to a swift end, but consistently declines to offer details and consistently refers to Vladimir Putin using favorable terms.
Because the outcome of that right now would have to be that the stuff that Russia has taken, that eastern third or so of Ukraine, that is a lot more pro-Russian, than Western Ukraine. Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine have a lot of different loyalties and ancestries that have gone back. Same with like Crimea before that, which overwhelmingly in their referendum sided with Russia and that annexation. So that is likely what would happen, I think, now with a Trump term. Is, I don't know, though, because, Zelensky, is he going to just be forced to it because the war is not going well for Ukraine? If Trump's going to convince him that, hey, you're just going to have a third of your country annexed, will that be something acceptable? Because remember, Ukraine is not in NATO, so you don't have that. But we've already seen, that Trump's not going to be all in probably on NATO endeavors,
leading many in the foreign policy world to believe that a Trump peace plan would favor the interests of Russia.
Whether you have talked to Vladimir Putin since
territorially it would.
President.
Well, I don't comment on that, but I will tell you that if I did, it's a smart thing.
On the home front, Trump's online campaign material pledges a, quote, state-of-the-art next-generation missile defense shield to guard against the threat of nuclear and hypersonic weapons. That defense shield initiative would be led by America's Space Force, although details are scarce. And when we look at Trump's first 4 years in office, we find,
I don't hear about that
in hindsight,
anymore.
that many of the basics of his positions have stayed consistent. During that tenure, Trump took active measures to orient the United States toward great power competition with Russia and China, something he clearly intends to continue doing in his second term. Last time around, on home defense, Trump took the unusual step of founding a new branch of the U.S. military, the
Remember
Space
Mike
Force,
Pence?
to protect American interests beyond Earth's atmosphere.
Space
During that time,
Force.
Trump threatened European officials directly with the prospect that America could abandon NATO, an act that Trump does not appear to be opposed to today. In prior years, Trump has taken a large appeasing approach toward Israel, symbolically shifting the U.S. embassy there to Jerusalem and recognizing Israel's control of the disputed Golan Heights while pulling out of America's nuclear deal with Iran.
I think now the rhetoric towards drastically changing United States involvement in NATO is being seen a lot more favorably, and will be seen a lot more favorably in this term than it was in the first term. Because the first term was never really something, I feel like, if you go back to before 2016, that was ever something really discussed or even like comprehended, that like being a part of NATO is like this, like a bad thing for the United States. And Trump, I think, was really kind of a cutting edge on that when he came in and was really like trying to highlight, his whole idea was that like the U.S. is getting like screwed over by NATO by propping up so much of it. But now, and that was seen a little bit like almost crazier. But I think now, where his supporters and that base has moved more towards I don't want to necessarily call it an isolationism, but, not as involved in conflicts, is a lot more supported, I think, now. And a lot of that might be in response to just the economic problems that have happened in the COVID era, where it's comes to this idea that is so strong when you campaign, where you're like, hey, how are we giving so much foreign aid to countries when we have our own financial problems? And I think that's one of the reasons why something like that, like pulling out of some of these agreements, would be a lot more popular now.
Trump also oversaw the 2020 Abraham Accords, when the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain normalized their relations with Israel, an act that Saudi Arabia nearly followed and reportedly still wants to. For the record, Trump also attempted an aggressive tariff regime in his past administration, though not nearly as aggressive as what he's proposing now. Back then, not just China, but the European Union, a close collective ally of the US, pushed back by applying tariffs of their own. As a result, the US and China ended up in a bitter trade war.
Trade wars.
Of course, Trump's public statements by themselves don't.
And again, you just have to wonder, how will a trade war improve foreign relations?
Tell the whole story. In both the current conflicts raging around the world and the conflicts that will inevitably arise during the next 4 years, President-elect Trump will have to react to changing circumstances in the moment. To understand how that will go, we've got to understand the broad strokes of his foreign policy approach, which break down, as best as we can establish them, into two main buckets: unpredictability and transactionalism. Trump's unpredictability and his tendency to create or stimulate uncertainty during interactions with both allies and adversaries has been lauded by his supporters as an asset since early in his first term. Referred to in some sources as strategic unpredictability, the argument in favor of this approach
we just call this
a time-tested rule of foreign policy.
Being a reactionary?
Nations make decisions based on what they predict.
More reactionary policies.
Those decisions, and based on whether they can assess a certain outcome will be positive or negative. But by introducing uncertainty, a leader like Trump can push other nations towards taking the safer option, the one less likely to lead to hostilities either on the battlefield or at the negotiating table. Take Trump's 2024 comments threatening not to support members of the NATO alliance who failed to meet their non-mandatory spending thresholds. The comments set off a fire.
I mean, that is one thing we'll say. Like he said, they were kind of saying like unpredictable with that. That's something he's actually been pretty consistent on. I'm sure he's going to be very consistent on is the NATO spending that the United States does in relation to what everyone else does.
A storm of criticism at home and abroad, but they also created powerful incentives within NATO nations to start spending more on defense and to do it quickly. Proponents of Trumpian uncertainty often cited as the reason that major wars didn't start under Trump's watch. For example, Russia didn't invade Ukraine until Trump was out of office. Whether or not the unpredictability approach is actually effective is a matter of ongoing debate, but the principle of the thing appears to guide Trump's actions abroad now just as much as ever before. And on the other side of the coin.
Now, remember the context of NATO, which is so forgotten. It was created largely by the United States as a deterrent against the militarization of the Soviet Union post-World War II. And it's always been largely been a United States thing, as it was seen as the leader and the only one they felt, especially after World War II, that could be some kind of deterrent force against the Soviet Union, as so much of Europe was, now ripped apart and moneyless and has no military power. And the whole idea, though, with NATO hasn't really changed if you look at it really over those years. I mean, NATO persisted after the Soviet Union collapsed. A lot of people have looked at that as maybe a bad misstep, that it was still in kind of bad faith that even though the Soviet Union and had a collapse and you have a regime change, that NATO, which again was created as a deterrent against the Soviet Union, no longer exists. So that right when this new Russian Federation was created, you're already off to sort of a bad foot, and not maybe either dissolving it or bringing Russia into NATO. So that's another thing I think that has to be analyzed too, is what is the function of NATO and what's its future going to be? Even if there is all this spending and things, what is the goal number one? Is it still Russia? And a lot of people will say that the existence of NATO is shown to still be necessary by what happened in Ukraine. A lot of people are now saying too that NATO's function as well could also be some kind of deterrent against, say, China, which again is a very different history than say the United States and the Soviet Union, because of the Cold War being between the Soviet Union and largely not with the with China.
Is the transactional nature of Trump's
in a military
policy.
sense.
The signs here are hard to miss. Take Trump's attempts to make American defense of both Taiwan and NATO contingent on other nations spending money. Or take the assessments by other nations like Japan that openly regard a second Trump administration as a transactional relationship. Of course, there's also Trump's clear reliance on tariffs, an explicitly transaction-based exchange as a cornerstone to foreign policy. By attaching the actions of other nations directly to economic incentives and disincentives, Trump's proponents will argue that he can more effectively leverage real, meaningful power and authority in ways that public statements, UN condemnations, and that sort of thing simply can't match. And the intense focus on transaction allows Trump to pursue a...
Does it seem like a mixed signal, though? Again, if you're going to use tariffs for this, it's like you're going to use it as a deterrent or something. I don't know. It's like pressure these other countries, but do you still want to have that relationship with them? Do you want to trade with other countries? Do you want to do that still?
A broader
Can you have it both ways?
Referred to as America First, in which the United States openly expects to receive tangible benefits from its defense relationships while exacting payment or trade concessions from its adversaries. Moving away from the broad strokes of Trump's foreign policy approach, we turn to personnel, and specifically the people who become key to America's relationships with other nations.
Yep,
At the time
we're
of
seeing
writing, none of the now president-elect's potential executive secretaries have been named, but speculation runs wild.
Started since I've done it.
Two posts in particular,
the one thing we know is it's totally different than the first one was. A lot of people distanced themselves from Trump. Trump also got rid of a lot of people he didn't feel were fit for the job. It's going to be very different. Yeah, and you're already starting to see it. So it'll be interesting, again, what things like ambassadors, and again, we already have our Secretary of State and of Defense now in place here. And we do have, well, again, one ambassador with Mike Huckabee, who I don't know if his appointment was one that was going to be seen as like a mediator to help the kind of balance out and tone down the sort of war in Israel. I'm going to have to learn more about what Huckabee says about that, but we just know how like pro-Israel, especially with his evangelical Christian background, how important that is, and how the idea of whatever it is that's happening with kind of like the Zionist movement or just Jewish population as a whole and their view on what is to happen with the area with Israel and Palestine. See what's going to happen there. But that appointment definitely doesn't show, though, the idea of like putting an ambassador there that's going to try to be like a mediator to both address maybe the Palestinian causes and also the Israeli causes. We'll see. Maybe it doesn't turn out that way.
Diplomacy-focused Secretary of State and the conflicts-focused Secretary of Defense will play a critical role in the new administration's foreign policy. American political news outlet Politico highlights 5 likely Secretary of States and 3 likely
Marco
Secretaries
Rubio
of Defense. Potentially
was nominated.
Rick Grenell, the staunch Trump loyalist who drove controversy as U.S. ambassador to Germany and served as acting director of national intelligence. There's Bill Hagerty, a senator from the state of Tennessee who works on the powerful Foreign Relations Committee. He's a China hawk and an opponent to Ukraine aid who served as Trump's ambassador to Japan.
Rubio.
There's Robert O'Brien, a former Trump
Rubio,
advisor who played a key role in freeing American
did say that
rapper
I think he
A$AP
interviewed
Rocky
multiple
from Swedish
people.
prison,
Trump did
and
interview
who has deep
different
positive
people.
ties with NATO, the EU, and Ukraine. The Senator Marco Rubio,
there you go.
a hardline voice on matters relating to Cuba and Iran, but who's tried to bridge the gap between Trump and the importance of support for NATO and Ukraine.
There is something interesting, especially with Rubio, in the fact that he was not a Trump supporter when Trump was getting going, and for a while really held out. I think a lot longer than a lot did to kind of jump on board. So was that Trump's first pick? I don't know about that, but it said that, he had talked to people. I don't know exactly how many people he was like interviewing, but yeah, we have Marco Rubio again, got that background a little bit more with like something with like Cuba, not going to be probably it seems pretty in line with Iran. Trump's stance on Iran is to be a lot more of a hardliner. In fact, he kind of blames the attack in October on Iran specifically because of kind of supporting Palestine, specifically Hamas, with their actions. So you have that rather than like the problem being, the conditions for Palestinians, but actually the problem was Iran. So I don't know if that just means like keeping up maybe the status quo in Palestine, which was before, being under a lot of control under Israel. Or improving those conditions, but I don't know. It seems more like, especially if you're gonna be using Marco Rubio, and what he kind of thinks of Iran is using Iran as the way to sort of end this conflict, I guess, with Israel and Palestine by trying to defang, I guess, the Palestinian resistance, which being through Iran, and whether that's going to be successful or not in their eyes, that's probably, we don't know. It's yet to be said.
Finally, there's Representative Mike Waltz, a former Special Forces soldier
it's Rubio,
who's taken positions in favor of US aid to Ukraine and against Chinese interests. On Politico's Secretary of Defense list, Waltz shows up once again.
Yep, we got that too.
Senator Tom Cotton in Iraq and Afghanistan.
See if it brings up Pete
Hegseth for the post since Trump's first term, and Mike Pompeo, who served as head of the Central Intelligence Agency and Secretary of State during Trump's tenure. Cotton is regarded as a war hawk and has consistently endorsed proactive sanctioning and military action. Pompeo is staunchly pro-Taiwan and anti-China and has called the Russian invasion of Ukraine a, quote, planned genocide, and endorses the idea that Israel has a biblical claim to the territory of Gaza and the West Bank. One other name to take note of is Robert Lighthizer, Trump's former United States
not elected either
in his first term.
Chosen.
Lighthizer was,
by the way, there is confirmations also happen with these, so there's a chance that these people, again, like Hesketh and Rubio, may not get in, but probably not gonna. I can't imagine they'll get blocked. I think the Republican Party is probably going to follow suit. At least that's my prediction. I could be wrong though.
The primary architect behind Trump's early tariff regime and trade war with China, and he's likely to take a lead role in any future Trump tariffs, either by returning to his old post or serving as Secretary of the Treasury. Aside from his likely cabinet appointees, the president-elect also accepts guidance and insight from a small handful of prominent national security advisors. Among others, the editorial...
So you're going to learn about Pete Hegseth is going to be the Secretary of Defense. Again, not a general. You're going to have Mattis is going to be gone. It actually looks like that a lot of generals and very high-end military leaders might be getting fired, because as president, you're also commander-in-chief, meaning military leadership, the president can't change. But yeah, Hesketh, he I forget how high he got sort of in the rankings, not nearly as high as a lot of the people that are above him. There's a lot more above him, but fought in like Afghanistan, fought in the Middle East, and is a common person that you see on Fox News. You'll see him as kind of hosting a lot of things. And it seems like one of the messages being out there too that Trump is going for is to, like, as many people might call it, like unwoke the military. And that's something you've seen Hesketh kind of talk about when he has talked about like trans soldiers or even women soldiers, saying that, that's been like prioritized, I guess, in a way of having them be more frontline service members. So that, this idea of like unwoking the military seems to be like a thing that they're going for, that they think will help the military. They think it'll make them less political, I guess, in a way, and thinking about political measures, and they think will be better for just the function of the military. So we'll see.
Editorial board of the outlet Foreign Policy highlighted the following in an August 2024 article. Elbridge Colby, Trump's former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, is described as the, quote, loudest and perhaps most cogent voice in Washington advocating a complete shift away from Europe, NATO, and Russia and toward the growing challenge from China. Colby is advocating.
So that seems a little more in line,
engage in a full defense,
maybe of what Trump would want, but
in opposition to China, with Taiwan as the most critical strategic priority. Fred Fleetz, former chief of staff of Trump's National Security Council, drafted a peace proposal between Russia and Ukraine that advocated direct pressure against both sides, threatening Ukraine with US aid cutoffs for non-compliance and threatening Russia for the same offense with all-out military support to Ukraine.
Probably wouldn't go in line as much, because still, I'm thinking that if the United States is going to mediate this war, it's going to include enormous territorial acquisitions for Russia from Ukraine.
Keith Kellogg, another former National Security Council chief of staff, worked on the same peace plan and supports a relationship to Ukraine and NATO that both fundamentally upholds both, but leverages aggressive negotiating tactics against both to ensure they fit with American expectations. Kash Patel, a Trump-era intelligence advisor and counterterrorism director, has been repeatedly highlighted as a potential director of the CIA. Lastly, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance has advocated a peace plan and deeply unfavorable to Ukraine, including an agreement never to join NATO, and agrees with the drive to frame China
I
as
thought he was still
America's
saying, like,
preeminent security threat.
him for
Finally,
Secretary of
like
Defense.
with any other person assuming the man
The Hesketh one was a little bit surprising, probably a lot more so than maybe even a Marco Rubio, even with Rubio's dislike for Trump in previous years, because this guy was seen more as like a talking head military guy, again, coming on Trump news a lot, or on support, very much supportive of Trump, but then going on, Fox News and being kind of with their talking heads at times. And, what was an Army veteran, but really kind of leapfrogging a lot of people that may have more experience in like administration of the military. But again, there's a lot of people that say that that's what's needed right now, that it has to be like that whole guard of elites in a lot of different departments of the government and of the military. Like it's like a draining of the swamp, I guess you would say. So these might seem surprising at first, but may go along with kind of the overall thing that Trump's likely going to want to do, which is really, really shake things up.
Council of National Leadership, President-elect Trump's actions will be informed by his connections to people outside US politics. And here we find a few specific connections worth discussing. The first is Trump's link to Saudi Arabia, and with it, the other oil-rich states of the Persian Gulf.
Ally of the United States.
Are thought to have a significant financial
and largely of Israel.
In 2021, for example, Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, received a $2 billion sum through an investment firm direct from Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, while in July of 2024, in the heat of election season, the Trump Organization announced plans to develop a luxury Trump Tower in the Saudi city of Jeddah.
Are you guys really critical of things that may look like, say, like a nepotism like that? Like, you think that's a very much like a nepotism appointment when they put Kushner in there to deal with a lot of these foreign relations? And how do you view that, like the appointment of that, like a nepotism versus the criticisms that people have of like DEI hires? Do you feel like those are in the same ballpark? Again, that kind of nepotism versus DEI picks.
The Trump Organization had announced another hotel project worth $500 million and located in the Gulf state of Oman just days prior. Trump has repeatedly praised Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, while son-in-law Jared Kushner has held discussions with bin Salman multiple times relating to negotiations between the US, Saudi Arabia, and Israel after accepting the prior $2 billion investment. Also important are Trump's links to Russia.
He's not a fan of that,
Putin, where not one, but two bombshell stories dropped in the waning weeks of the 2024
and how they framed the Jared Kushner stuff.
Via a book by famed biographer Bob Woodward, Trump is alleged to have had as many as 7 direct phone calls with Putin after having left office after his first term. Trump's campaign and the Kremlin.
And that makes sense. Because Putin obviously knows that he knows that Trump is definitely a potential candidate here, and communicating that he's eligible, of course, for being president. And they had a relationship before and would continue that. I'm kind of surprised when people are surprised by that, or like him dealing with Zelensky. Same thing, right? He's a very much a potential candidate that is likely going to play a big role in both of these for both of these men here.
Both denied the book's allegations, which also included that Trump had directly sent Putin testing machines for COVID-19 during his first term, at a time when those machines were in very short supply in the United States. In the second reporting item, the Wall Street Journal alleged on October the 25th, billionaire Elon Musk has maintained regular secret contact directly with Putin, discussing personal and political matters, and receiving a request by Putin to avoid activating Musk's Starlink internet service over Taiwan as a favor to Chinese leader Xi Jinping.
Well, Elon has also dealt extensively with Zelensky as well, in a lot of the support there. So it'll be interesting. The Elon thing is going to be really interesting because it doesn't look like he's probably going to get like a cabinet spot. I don't know if he even wants that, but what Musk said is, being a part of like a committee or a branch that can oversee government spending and efficiency. It sounds like that's something he would be interested in. They've also said, I heard that, even though the election now has been over for a long time, or for, a good over a week, basically he's just been staying at Mar-a-Lago and just like is still just there. He's like in these, I think, meetings and phone calls and with foreign leaders and stuff. Because once a president gets elected, you see a lot of foreign leaders, they make phone calls to him and they congratulate and start talking. And I've heard that Elon is like in those rooms a lot with those conference calls. It's kind of interesting how, I don't know how tight they're going to stay and what kind of the future of Elon Musk is going to be in any type of official capacity.
Musk took direct control of the Trump campaign's field operations late in the election
They got
cycle.
$100 million
$1
he supported
a day to voters and has already shaped political messaging in Trump's favor via the social media company X, formerly Twitter. In exchange, Trump has announced plans to grant Musk control over an efficiency commission with auditing powers over the entire US government, a plan that already drew concern before the possible extent of Vladimir Putin's influence over Musk was revealed.
Did anyone else wonder what the relationship's going to be like with, because like Trump has been critical of Elon before, especially before Elon really pledged his support to him. We know how Trump feels about like EVs, electric vehicles, and obviously Elon is the biggest manufacturer of like electric vehicles, and how they're going to, I don't know, get by on something that seemed like such a major thing that was part of Trump's rhetoric was with EVs. I just wonder what those kind of things. I mean, yeah, you have the support. They kind of like support, Elon supports him. But like when it comes down to the things that Elon also supports, will they see eye to eye? Will Trump then kind of flip his tone potentially on EVs because he has this like powerful ally in Elon? I'm kind of interested to see what that is going to look like.
The Wall Street Journal report claims that Musk and Putin's regular conversations have been confirmed by American, Russian, and European sources. With a grand view of Trump's policy proposals, past incumbent record, and points of influence all considered, we can now turn to the matter of forecasting how the world's important conflicts may evolve and what other conflicts may pop up during Trump's second tenure. And we'll begin, of course, with Ukraine. Trump has been consistent in his focus on establishing a quick, tolerable peace between Russia and Ukraine. He strongly implied that a peace that demands difficult concessions from Ukraine, including the long-term loss of major stretches of Ukrainian territory, would be preferable rather than continuing the war at all. As such, American overtures toward both Russia and Ukraine will likely begin shortly after inauguration, and under the circumstances, both sides are likely to come to the table.
I've thought, and this is again based on recent history, especially since 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, and of course going back further in Russian history, the whole idea of with when Ukraine was created and its border, also didn't really divide along people with pro-Russia or pro-Ukrainian sympathies. Eastern Ukraine and Crimea had have had a lot of Russian support. And there's also a lot of history that you can hear Putin talk about all the time about the Russian people and how important that land is. And you go back to the Kievan Rus and saying that's like where like Russians originated, because Putin's very much like a nationalist that way, and has been doing policy, it seems like, based off of this idea of Russian history and Russian ethnic ties to the region. But yeah, I don't think in any way this is going to end for Ukraine in a way that like they're going to keep all their territory, that Trump will come in and like tell Putin to leave. I actually don't even know if that's going to be the message. It doesn't seem like that is in any way the intent of the message, but will likely be a concession of massive territory of Ukraine if they want to end this without more fighting and what's happening, because Russia is very much in the driver's seat of that conflict right now.
For Russia,
and has been
we
for a long
Trump's
time.
Consistent praise for Russia's leader, the lack of voices in his own orbit that would advocate to push Russia out of Ukraine, and the dual allegations of continued conversation between Trump and Putin, plus the alleged closeness between Putin and Trump ally Musk. Those factors, taken together, suggest that the Kremlin would have reason to believe Trump would offer favorable conditions for a peace. On Ukraine's side,
probably
Trump has been abundantly clear that restrictions or a complete cutoff of Ukraine aid is possible. As a result, Ukraine can either choose to continue fighting.
You're way more likely to see a cutoff of aid to Ukraine than you would of Israel under this Trump administration.
Battle that would quickly become untenable and potentially suffer total defeat, or swallow an unfavorable peace at the negotiating table. The precise terms of such a peace are unclear, but we can at least take a few educated guesses. At a minimum, Ukraine's territorial concessions would likely include most of the territory Russia currently controls,
let's see if we
the
agree.
vast majority of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, and a stretch of territory that covers the land bridge to the Crimean Isthmus. Ukraine would likely have to relinquish control over the 700 captured square kilometers of Russia's Kursk region that it currently holds.
Donbass is gone.
It may gain a minor concession in return, pushing Russia out of a small pocket of land it controls north of Kharkiv. Russia may demand more, possibly.
I'm not sure if there's going to be a push that Russia will give up really anything. But I don't know. I could be wrong.
Full record.
By the way, do you believe what Trump said, going into this, that like he said the war would never have happened if he was president? Almost like the invasion would never have happened Do you think that's the case? Because that would almost like it almost like lead you to believe if he says that the invasion would have happened, that he would have told Putin to stand down and would have bolstered a lot of support for Ukraine, which definitely doesn't seem like the rhetoric that he has. But what do you guys think about that claim? And that's hard because it's an unfalsifiable claim to know if he would have done that, because it never happened. So you can't investigate that. You have to completely go by word of mouth. You have to trust what he says about his relationship with Putin, because his big thing is he says that the United States, he feels like, had more of a sign of strength as a deterrent for people doing aggressive actions around the world. And is that just something that's just a little bit of like hubris on Trump's part to say that's really how these other world leaders viewed him? Or is it true? What do you think about that one?
Recognition and control for the 4 Ukrainian
Because you can debate that all day.
Back in 2022, not just Donetsk and Luhansk, but Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. Crimea would also be included in any
Russia might not get everything they
these
wanted
demands as recently
or
as mid-2024. Other likely Russian demands would include a pledge from Ukraine and or NATO to permanently prevent Ukraine's accession to the bloc, a repositioning of Ukrainian troops away from the front lines, and possible restrictions on Ukraine's future military development. The removal of Western sanctions against Russia may also be on the table. As for Ukraine, every element of Volodymyr Zelensky's September 2024 victory plan would likely go out the window.
What do you think about the idea? What if this was a concession? And maybe Zelensky agrees, or at least is forced to, that has to give up territory. Maybe not everything Russia wanted, but maybe most of it, in acceptance of Russia publicly, stating that they would not have a problem with Ukraine joining NATO. Because one of the things that was kind of like understood by NATO and Russia was that there would not be NATO states that border Russia. So there would be kind of this buffer zone, if you will. Not totally different than like what the Iron Curtain was, where Stalin said, the Soviet Union has the right to have a military force literally up to the border of like NATO states, but some kind of buffer. Then we know that buffer it came down after a while, because when you got like the Baltic states, for example, which are right on the border there of Russia, but then also like Finland, joining as well. But I wonder if that would be a concession that the Russians, that Putin specifically, because we know he's very much in charge of a lot of these decisions, if that would be something he would concede as their acceptance into NATO's or Ukraine's acceptance into NATO.
Ukraine would likely demand concessions in its own favor. It's not clear that any of those concessions would be heard. As we've expressed previously, transactionalism is central to Trump's approach to policy, and in a situation in which Ukraine has little
give me something, we'll give you something.
Make credible threats, its bargaining power in a transactional arrangement is severely diminished. Ukraine would likely
is that the businessman in him?
Attempts to secure major concessions on Ukraine's behalf for reasons other than tangible benefit to the United States will most likely be absent. As for what happens after such a peace accord, that's something more of an open question. Although Trump himself has historically shown little interest in proactive nation building, his American advisors tend to agree in the broad value of upholding the NATO alliance, and even if Ukraine is excluded from membership, it could have some practical value to the United States. If a peace accord...
it could go the opposite. Maybe part of the concessions is that Ukraine will have to commit to not joining NATO. Maybe it's the opposite. I don't know. I think there's a lot of ways that stuff could go down if this conflict comes to a negotiated end.
Not include explicit controls on Ukrainian militarization, the United States may decide to engage with Ukraine as a military partner, procuring US-made equipment or sending US equipment to other NATO nations so that their kit can make its way.
I don't think that'll happen under Trump administration.
Both help deter Russian aggression in future years and provide direct transactional benefit to the United States by stimulating America's military-industrial complex. On the other hand, any arrangement that benefits Ukraine would likely face pushback by Putin, and where Trump is concerned, it's unclear how impactful Putin's input may be.
Yeah.
On Israel's conflict with Iran and its proxy forces, Hamas and Hezbollah, Trump's position...
This is where I think we're going to have a very different foreign policy for the United States. The United States, like, getting out of the Ukraine thing, but probably urging pretty much more of the Israel effort without conceding to the conditions for Palestinians. This is the one where I think there may be an inconsistency about this isolationism, especially when it comes to funding foreign wars.
It's no secret. While Trump has previously expressed some animosity towards Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after Netanyahu acknowledged Trump's electoral loss in 2020, Trump's positions and his past actions as an incumbent have overwhelmingly favored Israel. On the war in Gaza, Trump has advocated a swift
accept the cheated election to be his
ceasefire.
supporter,
Trump
I guess?
has indicated distaste for the optics of Israel's long-running invasion of Gaza, previously stating publicly on Netanyahu and the Israeli government that, quote, they've got to finish what they started and they've got to finish it fast, and we have to get on with life. But anyway,
do you think, would he say that, you think, publicly with like Putin as he would with Netanyahu? I know a lot of people will say, you know, they're not comparable characters, and a lot of people do like to, you know, maybe compare them, but that's going to be up to, you know, you guys analyzing it on your own.
Any restrictions on the use of force by Israel or any efforts to ensure protections by Israel toward Gazans have been absent. As a result, it's not unlikely that Trump may place pressure on the Netanyahu government to at least modify its operations in Gaza, but probably not in a way that would constrain the use of force. During his 2024 campaign, Trump pledged to cut off all U.S. aid to Palestinians if re-elected and urged other nations to do the same. He has pledged to bar Gazan refugees from the United States, and he's drawn many millions from prominent donors who advocate the demolition of the Palestinian West Bank. While these statements don't...
This is where I think the appointing of Mike Huckabee says and kind of confirms this stuff that he's saying about really kind of giving a lot more, giving maybe even more support or whatever for Israel and trying to, you know, complete this job quickly without the claims to what Palestinians are advocating for.
Lead to a specific vision for Gaza, they do indicate a willingness to stand aside for Israel. Neither Trump nor his close allies have given any indication that they would prioritize reconstruction in Gaza, oppose an extended Israeli military occupation there, or even oppose the establishment of Israeli settlements there. His son-in-law's comments on the potential value of, quote, waterfront property in Gaza certainly haven't helped those perceptions. In that case, however, and after more than a year of brutal war, it is unlikely that low-grade hostilities by Hamas or other Gazan resistance groups would actually stop. With regard to Hezbollah, Trump has been significantly more vague, making only occasional comments on the Israeli-Hezbollah conflict and referring to it at one point in early October as being similar to, quote, two kids fighting in the schoolyard.
This is where I wonder how much Trump knows about the history and the diversity of the relationships Israel and the United States has had with all of these states around them. Okay, you got like Palestine, you got Iraq, you've got Lebanon, you've got Saudi Arabia. Did I say Syria? Like Jordan. If he knows how different each of those relationships have been, I wonder if he knows the diversity of that history. And if he's not saying much about Hezbollah, does he know much about Hezbollah? Does he know much about how Lebanon government works? Because it's very different. They have these different groups and different like competing governments and parties in there. That's different than these other Middle Eastern countries. That's where I don't know. I haven't felt very confident in Trump is able to like speak about these things and understand the history. I've never gotten that confidence, I think, from the way he's spoken. And maybe I'm missing a lot of context for him in talking about these issues and the diversity of them.
But Trump and Hezbollah's major backer, the Islamic Republic of Iran, have a relationship that is firmly adversarial in nature. In his first term, Trump's so-called maximum pressure approach
Hezbollah is also not
the scrapping of a landmark nuclear deal, plus
the only governing force in Lebanon as well.
Banking, shipping, and more. Trump has sharply criticized his success of
also connected because of Shiism.
Trump has
Does he know much about the Sunni Shia split?
Nuclear deal could be possible, but almost certainly on terms less favorable to Iran. The relationship between the two countries is further complicated by Trump's 2020 assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani and Iran's apparent attempts to solicit the assassination of Trump or one of his close allies in retribution. But when discussing such an explicitly transactional foreign policy actor, it's worth asking whether there's one transaction that can overrule all of the others. And in this case, there is.
What?
Both via his Abraham Accords in his first term and in public statements since, Trump has been a strong proponent of normalization between Israel and the oil-rich nations of the Persian Gulf, especially Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, again, also share a clear financial relationship with Trump. As part of those normalization efforts, however, Saudi Arabia or other Gulf states may ask for specific policy actions: reconstruction in Gaza, the establishment of a Palestinian state, action toward Iran, and more. Trump appears to prioritize normalization efforts much higher than specific policies on Israel's wars with Iran or its proxies.
Yeah.
As such,
I mean, that makes more sense about those other nations, not the internal conflict, but the outside conflict. He's going to be less about Israel-Palestine, but more Israel-Saudi Arabia, that kind of thing. And it sounds just like with his rhetoric, he believes in more the peace through strength thing, where it's like basically you defang your enemies, which doesn't decrease the hostilities, but just believes that you just get peace by, again, like defanging your enemies that way, rather than like conciliation.
any conditions that the Gulf states introduce on the path to normalization are likely to be taken seriously. What those specific conditions would be, however, is much tougher to say until the Gulf states make a stance public. Besides the
They've been waiting and seeing what the
there are
election
two
is,
simmering
these
world
states.
conflicts that will earn particular attention from a second Trump
They've been on a wait and see.
First is the ongoing escalation between the nations of the Indo-Pacific, including the US and China, along with North Korea. The second is a wave of cartel violence in Mexico that appears only to be getting worse. With regards to China, Trump's attempts to directly demonstrate support to Japan and South Korea suggest that his administration may continue the ongoing policy of the Biden presidency, albeit with some changes. Over the last 4
But
years,
it does seem it would be inconsistent, especially from a military spending perspective, of maintaining those relationships if there's going to be a consistent policy about being the world's military and funding the world's military force. This is something that he's saying the United States should not be. And that will have to drastically change foreign policy, especially with someone like Japan or South Korea. It would require an inconsistency, likely.
the US has directly and indirectly brokered an increasingly complex web of alliances and partnerships across the region, hemming China in by creating a sort of informalized coalition and building financial and strategic incentives for each of its members to stay engaged and active. Trump's choices in advisors suggest that Taiwan will probably remain the ultimate flashpoint between China and the US, despite his past statements that Taiwan should pay directly for defense from the US, which, to be clear, may simultaneously become another point of negotiation. His tariff policies, already severe in his first term, are set for a rapid expansion into a new and more...
Will Taiwan pay more? Will Japan pay
How
more?
Trump would react to Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea, that's harder to say, but there seem to be two main possibilities. On the one hand, Trump could use
don't think he's not going to be a fan of that.
his ongoing naval confrontations with China to create a sort of red line to further expansion. That way, Trump could confront China there and daring Xi Jinping to try and push his luck. The other possibility, however, is probably the more likely one.
Probably push the buttons.
Transactional exchange with China, the South China Sea will just be one card on the table, and one that Trump may be eager to sacrifice in order to gain a concession elsewhere. Then, in regard to Mexico, the country has seen
We already know what he thinks of
explosion
Mexico.
violence in Sinaloa State, adding on
Don't have to
to
talk
a
about that much.
range of hostilities, both between cartels and the Mexican government, and between the cartels themselves. On Mexico, Trump has taken consistently hardline positions late in his campaign, threatening a 200% tariff on imported vehicles from Mexico if China attempts to build its electric vehicles there, thus skirting direct sanctions on China's EVs.
A lot of manufacturing in Mexico of American consumed goods.
Coming into our country, I'm going to immediately impose a 25% tariff on everything they send in to the United States of America.
In past years,
That's where I wonder if that's more just like trying to flex on these countries, or is it actual economic policy? But is it more about like sticking it to them? But the issue is that these have economic things. It's not a deterrence of things. It's going to have economic impact. That's where I wonder if it's good to weaponize that. Use tariffs as like a weaponization for foreign policy.
according to testimony by
Because again, I think there's the historical context has been great for that. I mean, we see sanctions. We've had those, and we've seen what like sanctions do, and have crippled countries. We know, and that's actually led to more extremist groups that arise in, say, like a Venezuela or an Iran or a North Korea. All of those where they have sanctions, you're actually getting more hostile extremism that comes from those areas. So I wonder if that is something to regard. And in a lot of ways, again, the strength through peace kind of policy that he is referred to says that, well, who cares if they have these extremist groups or the conditions that go in there as a result of sanctions, because they'll be defanged and won't be able to actually introduce any kind of harm to the United States. But again, we're talking about tariffs, meaning importing of these goods. but not on those countries specifically. He's talking about other countries, though, that are far more relevant to the American economy than, say, North Korea or Iran or Venezuela.
Officials and reporting by several major news outlets, Trump has advocated shooting missiles into Mexico to destroy drug labs, deploying kill teams into the country to assassinate or capture cartel members, and designate Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist
Those threats seem more like just threats.
Migration across the Mexican border into the United States was a core issue of the Trump 2024 campaign. While the specifics of any policy are unclear, Trump appears quite uniformly inclined to respond harshly to perceived offenses coming from Mexico's direction. After allegedly calling for direct deployments of US troops in the past, it's certainly plausible that spillovers of violence from Mexico may politically incentivize Trump to attempt precisely that action. As for the rest of the world's ongoing conflicts, Trump has made very few statements, if any, on the wars in Sudan, Myanmar, Somalia, Syria, the Congo, or elsewhere. But based on the broader factors that we've laid out, we can at least approximate how the president-elect may try to engage with those conflicts once he takes office. In Sudan, 2 Gulf states, Saudi Arabia...
Because again, the big difference is we've had a Trump presidency. It's not like if this would be such a more of a debatable topic if this was some other candidate. The Republicans had brought somebody else up, or a Democrat outside of the Biden administration had come in. But that's why you can talk about context, which is is what we do on this channel, right? Talk about context and discuss it in scope of current events.
Are taking opposing sides and fueling the nation's 2 warring factions. If Trump does weigh in, it will likely follow the interests of whichever
Saudi Arabia, Yemen, that's another one
to support. Equally likely, however, is that both Gulf states appeal to Trump directly to stay out of the conflict, which would in turn be a likely outcome if they asked. In Somalia, the situation is similar. The United States has few direct interests there, and Trump ordered a near total withdrawal of US troops from the nation in 2020. Both the Gulf states and Egypt,
if you're transactional in your policies, then yeah,
of accepting
you start abandoning those places,
are much more substantially involved there than America. Both Myanmar's military regime and its rebel groups have little choice but to work with and prioritize their most powerful neighbor, China, meaning that avenues for the United States to pursue its own goals are starkly limited until the conflict is resolved. In Syria,
Myanmar, a coup,
the state of Iraq and Syria might continue, or Trump may return to his broad first-term position that American troops should be withdrawn
Syria,
from
one of the places we did
worldwide. In the Congo, close US
interact with during the Trump era
to be the primary instigator of war, and any direct U.S. interest in the conflict would likely center on ensuring safe
specifically with ISIS.
Congo's natural resources, with little desire to weigh in on Rwanda and the DRC's fighting any more than necessary. So as we come towards the end of our episode, we've got to touch on...
I can imagine Trump will care about that.
To Trump's foreign
Rwanda,
policy
DRC.
That we've been hinting at throughout. That element is disengagement. Trump's proponents often tout his record during his first term, avoiding actions that would have drawn the United States into any new wars. And to be clear, that is what happened. But a byproduct of Trump's transactional foreign policy approach is that it incentivizes Trump and his administration to disengage from areas
new political term we can start using.
No potential for transactional gain. Yes, it's true that by disengaging from those places rather than devoting American military presence, intelligence, or diplomacy, fewer American interests are available to be harmed in the short term.
So what he's kind of defining in this, what he keeps using this term transactional, is that the foreign policy of how the United States intervenes and interacts with the rest of the world will be based on what did those countries stand to help the United States with? What does the United States get from them? And if you don't, the foreign policy is going to be a negative one or just kind of abandon and forget altogether. And so I don't know, what do you guys think about that, of the transactionalism policy? Is it good? Is it good for the United States? Is it good globally?
But that same approach creates significant foreign policy blind spots, and those are blind spots that China, Russia, Iran, and others all took advantage of during Trump's first term.
That is true.
War is expensive. War is messy. It's rarely the first choice for any nation. It's not the only metric to judge harm to U.S. interests.
So what's happening and what has happened is those blind spots he might be talking about, maybe those places, again, like a Rwanda, Somalia, some part of Africa that the United States will not be as involved with or not involved with at all under this kind of transactionalism. The fear or just reality is that China will fill those. China will come in to those countries and be the one that gives them aid or gives them funding, especially when we know that when it comes to infrastructure. China has been a big time funder of that, of a lot of countries. and in fact outcompeting the United States and American contractors and things, and be able to give better deals for lending money or services to build up, again, infrastructure in a lot of these decolonized areas and places that are post-colonial, that are still, even to this day after World War II, are still trying to build up in their country's infrastructure and a lot of basic things that countries need to kind of make that next step towards thriving on the international scene. So that's what some people are saying, is that China's influence globally will increase under this transactional policy that Trump may be engaging. And for some people, they don't really care about that. Some people may not like that, but it would also require some kind of policy that maybe they wouldn't agree with. So I don't know if it's going to be paradoxical here, that they think that, again, by having these blind spots and ignoring these areas will embolden the country that the United States seems to be almost fearful and competitive of, which is China.
Whether it's Russian Wagner mercenaries spreading across the world, or China's debt trap diplomacy, or Iran's establishment of smuggling networks to its proxy forces, America's adversaries operated in US blind spots constantly during Trump's first term. And while Trump's supposed unpredictability is supposed to keep those adversaries at bay, the most predictable thing about Trump's foreign policy, based on both his first-term conduct and his statements ever since, is that he will decline to engage in areas without a clear transactional benefit or risk to the US. Now, even if this second Trump term will see a peace brokered in the Middle East and another in Ukraine,
I think I would agree,
adversaries
based on the historical context,
to a permissive global environment where they can quietly advance their own long-term goals without attracting American attention. And finally, we've got to come full circle on the very first Trump policy we discussed in this episode: tariffs. Leaving aside for now the question of the Trump tariff plan's impact on the United States, we have to acknowledge that while these tariffs could be used as a carrot and stick, they also have potential to be a destabilizing force. To be very clear, our goal isn't to offer
there's something I believe
judgment on the tariff regime,
I have to
but
take
instead
a
to point out
position on
a
it.
logistical element that cannot be overlooked. The United States has extensive and complex trade relations with the vast majority of nations on Earth, and even if a country's exports make up a small portion of American imports, the value of the trade relationship for that host country could be far more substantial. The problem here
is huge. We know it can cripple countries if the United States disengages with trade with countries, or again makes it so difficult for them to trade with us, and it makes it not financially profitable. We've seen countries that can tank because of it. And what we have seen historically in those areas too is that is where extremism comes out. Okay, if the economic we see it in history, if economic conditions are bad, extremism takes over. There's coups, there's militarism, there could become religious fundamentalism. We know that happens. So if it's again this idea of transactionalism, rather than trying to increase a broader scope of wealth amongst all countries, that could affect the future very differently. But again, it also brings up the very, very question: is that the United States' burden to do so? And can the United States even do that and create this more globally lifted economic community where barriers are actually down? Like, is that something the United States even has the power to do? That's still something I think about.
Ensure that a tariff regime doesn't become a destabilizing force around the world, it would have to be carefully calibrated. That means going nation by nation and often import by import to ensure that the effects don't become ruinous for America's own trading partners. To invest enough government resources to monitor other nations' economies that closely would require a level of government oversight and bureaucracy that Trump's own statements indicate he wouldn't endorse. But to impose a tariff regime this extensive without that critical oversight could quickly become a recipe for disaster around the world. A sudden loss of a large part of the export economy in any nation is a massive problem. It can quickly lead to mass job loss, recession, and with it, popular discontent. When nations experience profound and long-lasting discontent, they become more likely to breed more extreme or even more violent opposition movements. They become more likely to turn away from America, the source of their hardship, and into the arms of nations that the US may consider adversarial. They become more inclined toward desperation in a world where the path from widespread desperation to outbreaks of violence is so very well trodden. In real-world terms, Such a process would risk undoing economic recoveries across many nations as those nations struggle to rebuild after the turmoil of COVID's economic disruption. It would risk creating pressure points in various nations that America's adversaries, particularly China, Russia, and Iran, can take advantage of.
This is where he's giving his
disinformation,
conclusion,
populist
personal
anger,
conclusions
and
here.
driving political change that helps them in the long run. It could very easily lead world nations into an ongoing initiative by Russia to try and move the world away from the US dollar, and in countries where polarization and extremism are already high, it could very well lead to war. The argument here isn't that Trump's tariff policy is intended to drive the world into turmoil, but actions have consequences, and even plans that are intended to economically benefit the United States have the potential for unintended and destructive consequences abroad. Those consequences, in turn, pose a risk of coming back to harm even America's interests in the long term. We explained it at the outset, and we'll emphasize it again. This analysis of President-elect Donald Trump's coming second term is rooted in the past actions, claims, and policy positions of Trump himself. Once he takes office, it'll be up to Trump and those around him to guide the United States through his term as they see fit. They will face challenges, they will enjoy successes, and they will find themselves dealing with circumstances that one way or another nobody could imagine today. But for the world's most powerful nation, it'll be the man at the helm whose final say will dictate an outsized proportion of how the next several years will go. We'll be here to cover and explain what comes next, and we hope you'll join us. Thank you for watching.
Final thoughts. All right, I'll keep my concluding remarks short because this video is already going to be one of the longer videos I've ever made because I did have a lot to say on and hopefully it's some relevant context to bring up all along the way. But you can tell here kind of Simon and, and he has these writers and stuff that do a lot of this, but I assume he agrees with most of it if he's going to, go through with what the authors and stuff are saying. But it looks like pretty hesitant and almost say fearful of what he thinks potentially could happen with the role of the United States in this next administration here. And I guess my question to you would be, after hearing these arguments, by the way, thanks for staying this long with me. Do you think these are valid concerns that he is sharing here? Also, if you are somebody outside of the United States too, like Simon is, how do you feel about this as well? How do you feel, about the health of maybe your country and just internationally and how interconnected we are? How do you feel about what potential foreign policy could be happening here with this second Trump administration and what impact it could have globally and felt by people like yourself that aren't in the United States? So you can let me know. There's a lot of things I know you can all respond to, and I ask you to respond to down in the comments. Feel free to do so. I encourage you guys to do that respectfully. And with that, we'll see y'all next time.